The year is 2006. Children are playing outside with sparklers in the evening, but Nisha is still busy at her study table with her homework. She is not only academically bright, but also a renowned singer at the district level. Although she wants to play outside with her friends, her father's rule is strict. Until she finishes her studies, she won't even get water, let alone play. Nisha obeys her father in everything, but her childhood seems lost amidst such rigid rules. No one understands her mental state. Her mother passed away in an accident and she is left with only her grandmother. The only way to keep her father happy is by excelling in her studies. One evening, after scolding Nisha, her father leaves the room and she begins to cry. An hour passes. When her father returns to the room and doesn't find her at the study table, he angrily starts searching for her. Suddenly, he hears a scream. Nisha has jumped from the balcony. The scene shifts to 2016. Amelia wakes up to the sound of her alarm and heads to the university. It's the day for the final semester results. When Amelia sees the result list, her heart sinks. She and her 3 friends, Maya, Fate and Amir, have failed, and the subject they failed in is psychology. What's worse is that the head of the department for this subject is none other than Mr. Bagdi, Nisha's father. Every student in the university fears him. The 4 friends discuss their situation in the corridor. Upon seeing them, Mr. Bagdi sternly tells them to meet him in his office within 15 minutes. As they discuss his strict demeanor, Maya brings up the story of his daughter's death. Everyone in the university knows that Mr. Bagdi's strictness was the reason behind his daughter's demise. In the office, Mr. Bagdi scolds them harshly, stating that in his 20 years of teaching, no student had ever failed in his class. For him, this failure is a matter of dishonor. As punishment, he orders the 4 of them to attend special classes every day at 5:30 p.m. during the short semester. When Amelia timidly asks if the timing could be delayed, Mr. Bagdi angrily agrees to shift it to 7 p.m. instead. While leaving the office, a small doll falls from Mr. Bagdi's table. Amelia picks it up and hands it to him. The doll was Nisha's favorite toy, and Mr. Bagdi always keeps it with him. Amelia's mother, who works as a seamstress, is not in good health. Thinking of her mother's condition, Amelia does not want to attend the evening classes, but her mother insists that Amelia graduate as it is her dream. Maya, too, is under similar pressure. Upon hearing about her failure, Maya's family decides to stop sending her money. Unable to handle the stress, Maya secretly consumes a specific type of medication which has been causing long-term harm. Overuse of any medication has side effects, and in Maya's case, mental health counseling is crucial. At 7 p.m., the 4 friends gather for the extra class, but Mr. Bagdi hasn't arrived yet. As they wait, Maya once again brings up the topic of Nisha. Amelia, being somewhat closer to Mr. Bagdi, is urged by the others to ask him about it, and they start joking around. An hour passes, and Mr. Bagdi still hasn't shown up. Just as Amir considers leaving, they hear the sound of a cane hitting the floor. Mr. Bhakti has arrived. The friends quickly ready their books, trembling with fear. Mr. Bhakti sternly announces that no one will leave the class for the next 2 hours. But there's something strange about him today. His gaze is vacant, and he sits still like a wooden doll. When he tries to write on the board, he repeatedly draws the same line over and over. Suddenly, Maya's phone vibrates with a message in the group chat. It says that their beloved teacher, Mr. Bagdi, passed away at 5:30 p.m. in a car accident. Shocked and trembling, Maya asks everyone to check the message. If Mr. Bagdi is truly dead, then who is in front of them? Maya tells Fate to use the mirror from her makeup box to check Mr. Bagdi's feet. Fate finds that his feet aren't touching the ground. Suddenly, the classroom lights go out, and Maya sees Mr. Bagdi's face. It's distorted and crushed. Terrified, the group grabs their bags and tries to leave, but Mr. Bagdi's harsh voice booms. "Where are you going? The class isn't over yet." Fate bravely turns around and sees Mr. Bagdi floating in the air. Terrified, they flee and report the incident to the gatekeeper. However, the gatekeeper dismisses their story, saying he is already late and needs to visit Mr. Bagdi's house. The friends accompany him to Mr. Bagdi's home, where they learn that the teacher had indeed died in an accident while returning from a routine checkup. His face was so mangled that it was unrecognizable. As the cold breeze outside shifts the cloth covering his face, the friends' hearts sink in terror. The face they see is the same one they saw just moments ago in the classroom. But how could this be? The next day, news spread across the campus that the 4 of them had supposedly seen Mr. Bagdi taking a class the previous evening. To suppress the rumor, Mrs. Gita summoned them to the office and announced that she would be taking over Mr. Bagdi's classes from now on. She also made it clear that she would not tolerate any false information. Many people knew Mr. Bagdi as his daughter's murderer, which might have caused some to imagine things about him. However, that very night, Mrs. Gita experienced a terrifying event. While alone at home, she felt Mr. Bhakti's presence. He was enraged at her for taking over his 4 students. Gita saw Mr. Bhakti's rotting corpse on the table, with maggots crawling all over it. Terrified, she tried to flee, but a bookshelf toppled over her, leaving her in a coma. Meanwhile, the remaining students decided to investigate Mr. Bhakti's family to inform them about the situation. However, no one knew much about his family among the group. Maya began sensing Mr. Bhakti's presence around her in strange ways. She felt as though he was watching her. She saw him following her in the college corridor, and when she fell down the stairs in fright, her friends came to her aid. With Mrs. Gita in a coma and their semester approaching, the students worried about how to handle the situation. They doubted anyone would believe their story about Mr. Bhakti's ghost. It was said that a spirit couldn't find peace unless it resolved its unfinished business. Amir suggested they consult Mr. Sharif. The next day, when they met Mr. Sharif, he advised them to pray privately the following day, as spreading such rumors around the university could create more problems. He also reminded them that ghosts, spirits, and similar entities were often creations of the mind. However, Maya's mental state continued to deteriorate. Her medication doses increased as she constantly heard Mr. Bhakti's footsteps and the sound of his cane echoing in her ears. At night, she could hear those eerie sounds in the corridor. As planned, the students organized a prayer session in Mr. Bhakti's classroom with a few other students. However, the flickering lights made the situation more unsettling. Cold wind swept through the empty campus, and Maya felt Mr. Bhakti's presence among them. Suddenly, the corridor speakers announced the names of the 4 students one by one. Strangely, no one else could hear the voice except for them. Mr. Bhakti's chilling voice demanded that they recite something. The voice was terrifying. The next day, Amelia asked her mother, "Mom, do you believe in the presence of spirits?" Her mother remained silent for a moment before replying. "I've heard from elders that when someone dies before completing their tasks, they can't let go of the ties to this world." That night, Amelia sat down to research Mr. Bhakti and his daughter Nisha. Could Mr. Bhakti have stayed behind for his daughter? She recalled how he once mentioned Nisha upon seeing the doll sticker on her bag. Old memories resurfaced in Amelia's mind. Was Mr. Bhakti burdened by guilt over his daughter's death? The neighbors had little to add beyond what was already known, but it was clear that Nisha's death had destroyed Mr. Bhakti internally. Meanwhile, Fate was reading a comic book late at night when Amir walked in. When Fate asked why he had come, Amir didn't respond and simply stood staring at the wall. Suddenly, the power went out. Annoyed, Fate went into the corridor, but the door shut by itself. When he turned around, Amir was nowhere to be found. Where had Emer gone? In the flickering light from outside, Fate saw a shadowy figure outside the window. The shadow grew larger and larger as it approached the window. Meanwhile, Emer, in his room, lit a candle, only for it to be extinguished by a sudden gust of wind. He heard the sound of a cane tapping on the floor. As he tried to escape, he realized the door had been locked from the outside. Books began flying off the bookshelf toward him as if thrown by an invisible force. Terrified, he reached under the bed to grab his phone. Just as he was about to call for help, he sensed someone behind him. Mr. Bhakti was standing there. Amir screamed in terror, and Fate arrived to drag him out of the room. Maya, on the other hand, ran out of her room and down the corridor, with each light behind her turning off one by one. Disoriented, she found herself alone on the top floor. From the left corridor, she saw Mr. Bhakti approaching with his cane. Overcome with fear, Maya fell from the top floor, dying instantly. The iron rods on the wall below pierced her body, leaving it torn apart. Amelia, unaware of these events, tried sneaking into Mr. Bhakti's house. Suddenly, a portrait of Mr. Bhakti fell off the wall and her phone rang. It was the news of Maya's death. No one could believe that the liveliest girl in their group was gone. The medications found in Maya's room revealed that she had been struggling internally. People realized how difficult it is to truly understand someone's pain from the outside. Maya's diary, found on her desk, contained sketches of Mr. Bhakti's cane, serving as proof of her terror. Everything Maya had seen or felt was real. But if it was all true, who would be next? Perhaps it would have been better to stay in class that day. That night, the 3 of them went to Mr. Bhakti's house, hoping to find some clues. After some searching, they came across Nisha's diary, which contained her mixed feelings of anger and love toward her father. They also found a letter written by Mr. Bhakti about his own daughter. Meanwhile, on Amir's balcony, he noticed Amelia standing there with a mysterious smile on her face. When Amir tried to hide in fear, he suddenly saw the enormous spirit of Mr. Bhakti standing in front of him. They all ran outside in terror and were shocked to find Riven waiting for them. Riven had followed them there after overhearing their conversation on campus. Riven assured them there was no supernatural presence there. Instead, everything they were experiencing was a figment of their imagination. He explained that Mrs. Gita, after the death of her husband, suffered from a mental illness. Investigations revealed that shortly before the incident, her medication had run out. And Mr. Bagdi's death had deeply traumatized her, leading to such occurrences. Even Maya was suffering from depression due to her parents' issues. Riven concluded that the events were merely coincidental. This led to a heated argument between Fate and Riven. Later that night, strange things started happening to Fate on campus as well. Emer even saw Mr. Bagdi's cane floating down the corridor toward him. When it got close, Mr. Bagdi's spirit grabbed Emer and dragged him away, but Emer soon realized it was just his imagination. On the other hand, while praying, Amelia thought she saw Nisha's doll shifting positions. Her attention was suddenly drawn to the garden, where she saw the spirit of Mr. Bagdi saying, "Amelia, when will you finish your studies?" Terrified by this, Amelia was visibly shaken. The next day, when they discussed this, Amelia shared that on Monday, Mr. Bagdi had asked them to stay in the classroom for 2 hours. They speculated that if they spent 2 hours there, perhaps his spirit would stop haunting them. Following this idea, they returned to the classroom at exactly 7 p.m. and waited. Suddenly, they saw a shadowy figure moving about. A piece of chalk on the table began writing on the board on its own, startling everyone. In a cold voice, Mr. Bhakti started calling out their names one by one. Suddenly, Fate saw Mr. Bhakti's horrific face and ran out of the class in fear. Meanwhile, Amelia received a message from Mr. Bhakti's neighbor, stating that the only surviving member of his family was his mother, Nurjahan. However, leaving the class before the designated 2 hours was risky. With no other choice, they hurried to Nurjahan's house. When they questioned her, the real truth was revealed. It was true that Nisha was terrified of her father, but the belief that Mr. Bagdi caused her death was entirely false. That night, after asking Nisha to study, Mr. Bagdi had left. Nurjahan secretly brought biscuits for her on the balcony as Mr. Bagdi had told her she couldn't eat until she finished studying. However, what no one knew was that Nisha had epilepsy. While eating the biscuits, she had a seizure and, unable to control herself, fell to her death. Traumatized by the event, Mr. Bagdi never spoke about it, believing it was his punishment. People accused him of being the cause of his daughter's death. Meanwhile, Fate was in a terrible state, scared out of his mind. He was haunted by visions of Mr. Bagdi chasing him in a terrifying form, growing larger and larger. By the time Amelia and Amir arrived at the university, they found Fate in a horrifying state in Mr. Bagdi's classroom. Fate was having strange hallucinations. Everyone kept wondering what Mr. Bagdi's spirit truly wanted. Perhaps after his daughter's death, he had dedicated the rest of his life to teaching. That night, after they left the classroom twice, they might have broken some unspoken rule. Amir suddenly thought he saw Mr. Bagdi hitting him with a cane, but in reality, Amelia saw Amir hurting himself. Now it was Amelia's turn. She tried to explain that they knew he wasn't responsible for Nisha's death, but the situation was entirely different. In fact, each of them was seeing Mr. Bagdi's form in one another. Trapped in an eerie illusion, they grew more entangled. At one point, Amir violently threw Amelia aside, injuring her severely. Gathering herself, Amelia picked up Nisha's doll lying nearby and held it up toward Mr. Bagdi, who was approaching her from the corridor. She said, "Sir, it's not your fault we failed. We are responsible for everything. You weren't just a great teacher, but also a great father. You only wanted the best for Nisha. Circumstances made you a villain in everyone's eyes." As she held up Nisha's doll, Mr. Bagdi's spirit froze. Years of humiliation and the stigma of being labeled his daughter's killer had tormented his soul. But now everything seems to change. Amelia no longer saw the monstrous Mr. Bagdi, but the beloved teacher they all respected. Just then, Nisha's voice was heard. Her spirit appeared and said, "Father, I'm here." Mr. Bhakti smiled softly, took Nisha's hand, and disappeared into a bright light. Some time passed. The three friends successfully passed their last semester under Mrs. Gita's guidance. Mr. Bhakti had taught them dedication, ambition, and love for work. He was a living example of these qualities, as his dedication to teaching remained even after his death. The scene shifted to the present day in 2024. Amelia is now a psychology lecturer, following in the footsteps of her idol. She has also developed a romantic relationship with Amir. Mr. Bhakti had once said the brain controls all our behavior and personality. Therefore, maintaining good mental health is essential. With this message, the movie ends.